Hey there, fans of the strange, dark, and mysterious. If you're into stories that make your skin crawl and keep you up at night, then buckle up because this one's a doozy. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? The stories. This roadside photo changed the search in minutes. They called it a routine missing person search, and for most of that morning, it really felt like a routine search. A line of cars idled along a two-lane highway, and a handful of volunteers moved like slow clock hands through brush. Kira Duvall was 31, and she worked nights as a paramedic who could not stop reading maps. She took a personal day to help because she had patched hikers before, and she knew how fast heat turns hours cruel. Her plan for the day was simple and responsible, and it fit the tone of the briefing. She would work the southern fence line, check culverts, and log anything that looked out of place with a phone photo. The county sheriff had warned everyone about trespassing, and a deputy repeated the same rule in a firm voice. The missing man was named Owen Brackett, age 42, and he worked as a crane operator at a quarry north of town. Owen had left a garage sale with a box of tools, and a neighbor reportedly saw him turn toward the state highway. His sister filed a report after unanswered texts piled up overnight, and dispatch logs showed a welfare check on his small rental. He was not inside, and the bed was flat, and two mugs sat near a drying rack like small sentries. Kira walked that fence line with a volunteer named Bryn, who carried a bright orange notepad and a quiet focus. They talked little, and they moved in a steady pattern that felt almost like work at the station. The sun hummed through the haze, and cicadas made a loose electric sound over the ditch water. At 11, a deputy waved everyone toward the gravel pullout near the mile 11 marker sign. He wanted to regroup because the northern team had found a set of shoe prints near a culvert and needed space. Kira capped a water bottle, and Bryn checked the notepad, and they headed in with a slow trot. The meeting was short and clipped, and it held its shape like a sturdy box. The prints matched the size the sister described, and they angled toward a tree line that cut the field like a zipper. A drone team would scan the shadowed area, and everyone else would shift south by 2 miles and reset. Kira slid into her dusty sedan and checked her phone before moving, and that choice bent everything. A community page had started filling with posts, and a moderator had asked locals to send any roadside footage. One post sat near the top with a lot of comments, and the author had written a single line, "Is this him? Or am I seeing things?" The photo showed a shoulder of road near a farm stand, and a compact truck with a dented tailgate. A person stood beside it with a box in his arms, and the blur of the face did not help much. The timestamp showed yesterday at 4:12, and the location tag used a generic label. Bryn leaned in and squinted because the light was hard on the screen. Kira took a screenshot, then another, and she pinched the image until it turned blocky and awkward. The truck bed had 2 items that did not fit a garage sale box, and that was the first small tap on the door of her attention. One looked like a narrow metal rod wrapped in tape, and the other looked like a folded bag with a reflective stripe. The comments argued about whether it was Owen, and a few people mentioned a similar box. The moderator wrote that the photo had been sent in by a traveler passing through, and that the original file was higher quality. Kira tried the contact button and sent a quick note with her name and the number on the volunteer badge. They drove south to the new grid, and the phone buzzed with a reply that carried a simple greeting. The traveler introduced himself as Linus, and he wrote that he had taken the photo for the farm stand sign. He said he was willing to share the full resolution image, and he attached it with a short, polite line. Kira opened the file, and the world shifted 1 notch toward clear. The folded bag was a safety triangle case, and the wrapped rod was a roadside jack handle with old tape. The truck had a sun-faded sticker for a fishing club 2 counties east, and a circle of mud on one tire suggested a recent dirt turnout. None of that made it Owen, and none of it placed him where the drone team worked hard. Then she saw the highway sign reflected in the farm stand glass, and the letters formed an odd mirror riddle. She rotated the phone and zoomed again, and the sign resolve clicked into place like a knot pulled tight. The number sequence matched a spur route that did not exist near the quarry or the culvert with the prints. Bryn watched her face and asked a question with no extra words. Kira answered in the same thin tone, and it sounded like 2 people trying not to scare a deer. The reflection showed spur 118, which only cut across the western ridge and met the old freight road near the radio towers. That was miles from the organized search, and it was the kind of road people use when they know it well. Kira called the staging number and asked for the sergeant who handled evidence intake at the pullout. She explained that a community submission included a reflection that might place the photo near the western ridge. The sergeant asked for the file, and she sent it, and then she sent a marked-up copy with a red circle around the reflection. Her voice felt steady but pointed, and she stayed inside the lanes of what volunteers were allowed to say. Dispatch called Linus to verify the time, and archived call notes later reportedly showed a clean match with his phone metadata. A deputy drove to the farm stand to confirm the angle, and his body cam captured the same letters when held at shoulder height. The sergeant asked the drone team to hold, and a small unit broke off toward the ridge with a calm, deliberate speed. Kira and Bryn reached the new grid and parked near a cattle gate that had a brown rope for a latch. The radio traffic shifted slowly, and it sounded like someone unfolding a map in a windless room. A second photo arrived from Linus, and it showed the farm stand chalkboard with a faint line of numbers written low. The numbers matched a delivery price list and the date, and a small logo that narrowed the stand to a single family. No private names made the air, and the unit handled it with care that felt almost like a quiet prayer. Kira received a thank you text and a note telling her to continue the assigned grid until instructed otherwise. She felt relief and restraint share one chair, and she went back to ditch water and briars and the chirr of cicadas. A call-out went to a tower contractor who reportedly kept a service log for access gates near the western ridge. He confirmed that a gate lock had been replaced 2 days earlier after being cut, and he sent a photo of the new brass shine. That photo sat next to Linus's image in the channel the sergeant used, and the pair looked like two buttons on a single coat. None of this guaranteed Owen had driven there, and the unit held the line on that sober point. Two residents near the spur told a deputy they had heard a truck with a loud belt late afternoon, and the detail matched the neighbor's note about Owen's squeal at idle. The deputy wrote that down as a witness statement, and he did not add any flourish beyond the time. A camera at a decommissioned way station still recorded to an old cloud account, and an archived clip reportedly captured the same dented tailgate. Kira thought about how people leave a breadcrumb trail even when they do not mean to leave anything. The farm stand glass, the chalkboard, the way station cloud, and the tower log drew a path that no single person owned. She worked her grid with a calm pace, and she answered Bryn's small questions with the patience of coworkers at a long shift. At 2:15, the radio clicked alive in a tone that set everyone breathing shallow for a moment. A unit had found a compact truck pulled off on a shelf road below the western ridge, and the plate matched Owen's registration. The truck sat at an angle with two wheels and scrub, and the safety triangle case was open near the bumper. A box of tools rested on the passenger seat with a folded receipt that listed sockets and a tape measure. They did not broadcast names, and they did not describe medical conditions over the air. The sergeant used a spare line to request medical support that fit a non-emergent transport. A paramedic unit rolled in from a highway turnaround, and Kira watched the dust rising from miles away like a signal made of powder. Hours later, an official note stated that Owen had been found alert and dehydrated, and that he had messaged family. The truck had a failed fuel pump and a dying belt, and he had tried to flag help before climbing for better reception. He slipped on loose gravel by the cut and decided to wait, and his phone battery gave up near sunset. He stayed close to the truck, and he drank the bottled water from the garage sale box that had sounded so ordinary. The investigation continued in the tidy way that follows relief, and it collected details that felt useful but unglamorous. The farm stand owner confirmed the timestamp on the chalkboard through a drawer receipt that matched the hour of the photo. The tower contractor saved his gate log for the file, and the way station clip was downloaded before the old cloud account could rotate storage. Nothing in those artifacts turned dramatic, and all of it built a single sturdy ladder that reached the shelf road. Kira went home after handing over her notes and a neatly labeled folder of images. She sat at her kitchen table and felt the quiet ring in her bones, like something that wanted a name. The day had not been lucky, and it had not been heroic, and it had not been cinematic either. It had been a long, tight weave of small, precise things that met each other at perfect corners. She texted Bryn a simple line and thanked her for the careful walking and the steadiness. Bryn replied with an emoji, then caught herself and sent plain words that matched the briefing rules. She wrote that the photo had been the hinge, and that Kira had noticed the hinge before anyone else did. Kira answered with a line that cut the praise in half and kept the useful part. A week later, a brief statement appeared on the county site and did not mention volunteers by name. It thanked a traveling witness who had shared a clear image, and it thanked locals who stayed off the ridge during the search. It emphasized the value of precise information, and it asked the same thing people always get asked when time turns cruel. Share what you see, and do not guess more than the picture allows. Kira read it during a station break and thought about the reflection in the farm stand glass. She thought about how often truth hides in edges and mirrors, and how a mile marker can sit inside a pane like a secret. She filed the day under a private label and promised herself to keep looking for letters where letters should not be. That promise felt like a job that anyone could do, and also like a job that some people never think to try. When people later asked about the moment that moved the search, the answer sounded almost too small. A traveler took a picture of a sign, and a volunteer noticed the wrong route in the reflection, and a team shifted. The story made no room for grand statements, and it did not need a raised voice or a perfect ending. It needed an image, a circle of red pixels, and a ridge road where a truck sat angled like a held breath. Owen went back to his routine, and a friend reportedly drove him to a mechanic who understood old belts. He brought a pie to the farm stand as a thank you, and he kept his name off any posts that asked for a retelling. The family put the box of tools back on a garage shelf, and the receipt curled into a corner like a tidy leaf. His sister changed his phone charger for a tougher cable, and she set an alert for check-ins that would not nag. Kira kept working nights, and she drew grids in her head while folding gauze or checking vitals and stoplights. She believed in documents, and she believed in witnesses, and she believed in plain, ordinary pictures that steal a detail. She did not frame it as fate, and she did not call it anything with a shine. She called it paying attention, and she let the phrase sit like a low, steady light behind her ribs. Some stories end with a headline, and some stories end with a sentence that barely dents the air. This one ended with a screenshot, a small glass reflection, and a map where a wrong turn finally made sense. The title that made the rounds sounded dramatic, and the truth behind it stayed comfortably simple. A roadside photo changed the search in minutes because someone looked twice and then told the right person fast. The stories. These archived tapes were a warning at the lake. The county kept a box of old tapes that nobody requested, though people mentioned a lake in half the labels. Each reel carried a handwritten date in faded ink, spanning from 1984 through 2001, then stopping abruptly. Rena Valdez was 34, a county records technician who covered the public window and handled the backroom shelves. She had planned a quick shift, then a quiet drive to her sister's apartment for leftover stew and television. The box of tapes ruined that plan because the new intern stacked it crookedly, and the lid slid open suddenly. One cardboard sleeve read Lake Patrol. Another said Ranger Tower 2. The thickest sleeve said Dispatch Saturdays. A note at the bottom said duplicates for training, reportedly returned after audit, do not discard. The dates matched a period locals still referenced with nervous jokes, which meant details might still identify private people. She logged the box in a generic way, using the Lakeshore District and a wide date range to protect identities. She told herself it would wait until Monday, then she found herself winding a reel on the library machine. The machine clicked softly, and a voice filled the tiny playback room, thin and metallic. The first tape was a ranger briefing about posted signs and seasonal closures, and nothing seemed strange at first hearing. A man listed wind patterns, then a woman read names for volunteer cleanups, and then someone said maintenance reported missing bolts on the north dock. The voice added that the bolts were not stripped, they were removed carefully without damaging the boards. A second tape included a dispatcher answering calls about diesel sheen near the old boat ramp. According to the label, fishermen reported a smell like hot plastic, and a teenager reported chain rattling under the planks after dark. The dispatcher kept people calm while advising them to stick to lit areas and avoid the roped section. Rena paused the machine and wrote notes in her spiral. keeping each line factual with times and initials. She checked the storage log for incident reports from those dates, and the log showed vague entries about routine patrol and no injuries. It seemed like a cluster of small maintenance problems, which did not explain the careful script on the warning sleeves. She switched reels, and a new voice took over, quieter and closer to the microphone. The label said Saturdays 2, with a date from 1991 in shaky handwriting and a stamped number. The voice mentioned archived calls about chain noises again, and added that footprints led down the roped section in soft silt. Someone in the room asked about weather, and the answer was light wind, clear night, no boats scheduled after sunset. The voice then read a memo that asked rangers to log all interactions with a particular vendor near the snack stand. It said, "Do not escalate, document demeanor, and confirm hours against posted permits," using a separate clipboard. Rena recognized the clipboard instruction style, which matched old county risk templates for potential liability tracking. Vendors generated paperwork when things went sideways, especially near open water with kids, which made steady documentation crucial later. Still, the tapes kept circling the same triangle of dock bolts, chain noises, and the roped section. She printed a map from the binder with blank labels, then drew a tidy triangle between the dock, the snack stand, and the ranger tower. The map helped her visualize lines of sight, and she started marking places with little asterisks for maintenance incidents. The roped section sat slightly east, hidden from the snack stand by cottonwoods, which mattered for visibility. Another reel played a clipped exchange where a ranger told dispatch that a gate lock appeared new and unregistered. The ranger added that cones were moved and a laminated warning sign had clean nail holes without rust. The dispatcher asked for photos, and the answer was already taken and copied for the folder labeled permits. The next tape changed tone with a shaky breath before an officer started reading notes into the recorder deliberately. He said witnesses reported a loud splash near midnight, then a truck engine idling on the far turnout. He said tracks showed heavy tread, then lighter footsteps heading back alone, and a partial plate was recorded without certainty. Rena stopped and checked the case index, trying to locate an incident number referencing a midnight splash during that month. The index only showed a maintenance order for replacing stolen chain and a request for more reflective tape. She underlined the lack of a matching incident and added a small arrow to her running list for later verification. On Tuesday morning, she asked her supervisor if she could inventory the box more thoroughly since the reels were fragile. He nodded without interest, telling her to log whatever needed logging and to shove the box behind tax rolls. That gave her private time in the playback room, which she used to build a timeline on fresh paper. She listened to another Saturday tape where a woman from the tower called dispatch about a boat drifting across the boundary. The boat moved lazily, but the line drifted toward the roped section, which was posted as no entry. The woman sounded firm, and she logged the time. Then she asked for a ranger with a bullhorn. A tiny clink echoed on the tape before a second voice said, "Hold on," then added that a chain was loosened again. The tower watched two shapes bending by the boundary floats, and the dispatcher repeated the request for immediate response. Sirens filtered faintly through the recorder, then the tape ended with an abrupt click that did not feel accidental. Rena checked the log again and found only a note about routine lake closure with citation for boundary violation. She highlighted the citation number and scribbled a request to pull the paper copy from the offsite cabinet. If the citation sheet had officer notes, she might find names replaced with initials and a vendor detail. In the afternoon, the intern returned with coffee, and Rena asked if he knew the lake from hiking around. He said his cousins called it the turnaround because teens use the far turnout to swap drivers late at night. He said people heard the chain in the wind and joked that it meant a shift change for the lake. She asked about the vendor by the snack stand, and he shrugged, saying an older guy sold bait from a cooler. He added that the man kept to himself, and that the stand closed after 2003 when bathrooms needed repair. Rena thanked him, then went back to the machine, because one more reel had Ranger Tower 2 in heavy ink. The reel opened with playful teasing about coffee. Then a woman said the boundary floats were drifting again toward the shallow shelf. She made a note that the vendor stayed late, counting cash, and that 3 pickup trucks idled by the turnout. She said wind from the ridge pushed small waves against the dock posts, and the sound carried. Then came a gentle thud, and the woman said quietly that bolt heads were missing again on the north ladder. She asked anyone nearby to bring a camera and mentioned small shavings near the posts, like metal caught and ground shiny. She said it looked new, not weathered, and suggested logging it as tampering after checking permits. Rena wrote ladder bolt heads missing and circled the phrase carefully, then drew a line to the earlier chain note. She felt the outline of something organized, not merely bad luck, and the tapes added a pattern of late Saturdays. She felt a pinch of frustration because the official paper trail looked deliberately harmless compared to the recordings. She filed a request to review tower logs that year, and the clerk gave her a battered binder with loose pages. The tower logs used pencil, and the Saturday pages looked smudged, but several entries repeated a vendor name pattern. The pattern matched the earlier instruction to log demeanor and hours, which meant quiet escalation without confrontation. An evening tape from 2001 began with static. Then the dispatcher said the tower line would record summaries every hour. The tower voice read weather, then listed vehicles, then paused at a truck with a partially obscured plate covered by dust. The tower added that the truck bed held a heavy chain coiled flat and the ends taped tight. Rena felt the air in the room go thin. Though she knew she was just listening to old caution collected for audits, the tower voice kept going, steady and calm, calling out 2 sets of footsteps and 1 pair returning alone toward the turnout. Then the tower said the vendor appeared nervous, closing early and locking a cooler with a new padlock. Another reel documented a ranger walking the roped section at dawn, taking photos of raw scrapes on chain links. The ranger said the scrapes were bright, not dull, and the boundary floats had new gouges near the welded rings. He guessed someone had dragged the chain to the shelf, making deep channels beside the ladder posts. She studied the map again, measuring distances with the edge of a note card and aligning the triangle to the shoreline. The shelf sat where the cold current ran channel to channel, sucking down loose gear and stunned fish every spring. If someone knew that flow, they could use it to hide things quickly, maybe even move something heavy without splashing. The county maintained a box of anonymous tips from that period, and Rena requested the file through the clerk quietly. The tips mentioned fights in the turnout, and a truck with fresh dents, and late-night cash counting by the stand. One tip described a crying woman near the chain in 1991, then wrote, "He told her to get in now." Rena breathed slowly and kept her notes clinical, because she was not a detective and the tapes were not a case file. She wrote potential domestic dispute near boundary, then wrote check for missing persons in overlapping county dates. She cross-referenced the years against a public list of unresolved reports, without printing names or addresses. Within that public list, several families had posted memorial pages that mentioned the lake vaguely without pinning a location. The dates brushed the Saturday span, and at least one message thanked volunteers who had searched old drainage channels. Rena did not draw conclusions, but she felt the box had been kept near the window for a reason. The thickest reel contained a training segment that sounded like a quiet warning wrapped as procedure. A supervisor read instructions for dock inspections, then emphasized that bolts should be numbered and painted once installed. He said repeated substitutions by outside contractors had caused confusion, then urged rangers to photograph every ladder each week. He read slowly, reminding staff to check chain markings and to log any bright scrapes within 24 hours. He asked that vendor interactions stay cordial but detailed, and that cash counts should match posted hour sheets precisely. He repeated that night closures had reasons, and that the roped section protected a shelf known for unpredictable suction. The tape ended with a short statement that felt heavier than a standard sign-off, even to someone outside enforcement work. The supervisor said the lake keeps receipts, and he called tape steel a kind of ledger if you knew how to read. He then asked that all summaries be placed in the Saturday binder, followed by a written note in the permit folder. Rena returned the reels to their sleeves, then updated the entry in the inventory system with a quiet summary. She wrote that the contents included dispatch summaries, tower logs, and training instructions, and that these might interest risk management. She flagged the box for restricted copying and added a line suggesting improved storage due to evidentiary value. That night, she drove to the lake and parked by the official overlook, staying within the open hours like a normal visitor. The water looked glossy and harmless, and a steady breeze shoved new leaves across the shore in rattling waves. Families packed up coolers, while a ranger checked the rope line and reset a slack float with a practiced tug. She walked the path between the tower and the snack stand, then down to the dock where the ladder bolts gleamed. They were painted red, and small numbers were stamped into the heads, which suggested a new practice after the tapes. A sign near the rope read "No entry, shelf unstable," and the letters were bold without clutter. A man in a lake crew shirt saw her taking photos and asked if she needed anything, and she said just admiring. He nodded and said they had redone the hardware, then added that the chain had been upgraded to a heavier gauge. He pointed out a new anchor a few yards deeper where the current used to pull and said it cost plenty. She asked if the improvements followed a particular incident, and he smiled without offering details, then looked toward the tower. He said the lake gets busier every year, and they prefer keeping rules friendly and simple to help everyone. He wished her a good evening and kept walking, tapping each cleat along the dock with a small hammer. At her desk the next morning, she wrote one final paragraph for the internal memo, careful with every single word. She explained that the tapes documented a pattern of weekend tampering around a hazardous shelf with persistent chain disturbances. She wrote that witnesses described idling trucks and partial plates, and that tower logs flagged a vendor for careful tracking. She recommended digitizing the reels, then filing them with risk management as potential warnings that improved current safety practices. She attached her timeline and map using initials and generic labels to avoid identifying anyone who might still live nearby. She kept her tone neutral because the point was preservation, not drama, and the tapes already carried weight. Before sealing the memo, she added a small line that explained how the tapes worked like a quiet lighthouse. They glowed in the dark of back rooms, keeping watch over a place that looked relaxed but demanded attention. They did not accuse anyone directly, but they pointed toward the triangle where the water kept its swift accounting. She delivered the memo to her supervisor, who skimmed it, then set it aside for the weekly folder without comment. He asked if the reels were labeled securely, and she said yes, and he nodded and said good, thank you. The box returned to the shelf, but the entry now carried a bright strip indicating restricted handling under department guidance. A week later, risk management requested digital transfers, citing an internal review of seasonal safety procedures for public areas. They noted that the dock hardware had improved and that the chain layout matched new engineering reports after recent surveys. They asked for any additional recordings from surrounding years to complete their context for training material. Rena stayed out of that conversation because her role stopped at preservation, though she felt a calm sense of completion. The Saturday binder had finally spoken in full sentences, and everything pointed toward the same quiet conclusion. The tapes were a warning written in small sounds that added up to a clear map of careful harm. When she finally visited her sister that weekend, the stew tasted warm, and the apartment felt crowded with plants. She described none of the lake details, only saying she liked hearing old voices explain rules that still mattered today. Her sister laughed and said she had always loved rule followers because they were the ones who kept doors from sticking. In the months that followed, the dock signs stayed bright, the chains stayed tight, and the roped section kept its distance. Families watched sunsets without wandering across the floats, while rangers checked the ladder bolts and stamped numbers. A new plaque near the overlook said thank you to volunteers for years of safe seasons without naming anyone specifically. People told stories anyway, because lakes attract stories, and most were harmless and not entirely accurate. Rena preferred the tapes because they never chased drama, and they always returned to measured facts. They cared about footprints on silt and bright scrapes on metal and the way a current can tell time. If someone asked her privately why a box of tapes mattered, she offered a simple answer without personal detail. The lake taught the staff to listen for small patterns, and the tapes taught the staff to write them down. Warnings are not always loud, and sometimes they arrive as quiet instructions that keep strangers safe. She thought of the supervisor who said the lake keeps receipts, and she believed him without needing a name or headline. The water gave back bolts and shavings and slack rope, and the staff learned to read that ledger patiently. In that way, the old Saturday voices kept working, guiding hands without demanding attention or applause. By the next summer, the tower logged more visitors and fewer citations, and the vendor stand sold cold drinks, not bait. The chain still hummed on windy nights, but people heard it as a plain boundary, not a rumor. The tapes stayed in climate storage, digitized and labeled, a warning preserved as training rather than tragedy. When the county finally archived the memo with the transfer receipts, Rena slid a copy into her personal binder. She liked the neatness of an ending that did not demand a dramatic reveal, only patient steps that matched evidence. The lake did not need a ghost, it needed attention, and those tapes had asked for it many years ago. She drove by the overlook after work one evening, watching the sun burn down into a clean line on the water. A ranger tapped the cleats again, just like before, and the chain lay tight and bright across the current. The triangle she drew on paper felt like a familiar shape in her mind, precise and ordinary, and finally understood. The stories. Night guard who logged footsteps, no camera recorded. The night it happened, the security office at the old Westmore shipping depot smelled like dust and burnt coffee. According to shift logs, a 42-year-old guard named Dennis Halbrook clocked in at 11:30 p.m. and wrote a short note. Asterisk. Routine patrol. Clear floor. Humid tonight. Asterisk. He was the only guard on duty. By dawn, his chair was empty, his flashlight was lying under the main stairwell, and the building's cameras, 8 of them, showed nothing from the hours between midnight and 2. Westmore had been a Rust Belt landmark since the late 1970s, a concrete maze of loading bays and silent conveyor belts on the edge of a quiet Midwestern town. Dennis had worked there for 7 years, divorced, reliable, usually quiet. The kind of man who showed up early and read old paperbacks during breaks. That night was supposed to be uneventful, just a standard walkthrough before the building was scheduled for renovation. Around 12:10, he logged a line in the duty notebook kept beside the monitor screens. Asterisk. Footsteps on mezzanine catwalk, west wing. Checked cams, no feed, asterisk. A minute later, asterisk. Still hearing it, will inspect, asterisk. That was the last thing he ever wrote. The plant's internal system backed up video every 6 hours. When investigators reviewed the footage from the mezzanine camera, the feed cut to static precisely at 12:08. Other cameras kept recording fine until 2:30, showing only flickering lights and empty halls. A maintenance worker named Harold Cortez arrived early that morning to replace fluorescent tubes on the ground level. He found Dennis's flashlight lying on its side, beam still weakly glowing, and the notebook open. No sign of struggle, no torn fabric, no blood. Just footprints, 2 sets tracked faintly through the dust. One set from Dennis's standard issue boots, the other, smaller, bare, leading to the freight elevator that hadn't worked in months. The county sheriff's department filed the case as a missing person. Official notes cited malfunctioning surveillance and probable equipment interference. But people who'd worked there doubted the malfunction explanation. Westmore's night tech, a woman named Carla Wynn, swore she'd serviced those cameras the previous week. They were old, but fine, she told local reporters. The cables were intact. You can't lose a feed that clean unless someone cuts power at the board. Dennis's sister, a nurse named Ruth, said he'd called her the night before. He'd sounded distracted, mentioning he'd found a second badge lying by the locker room door. She assumed he meant another guard's ID, but the company only issued one active credential, his. Archived building logs later showed the same badge used twice that night, once when Dennis clocked in, again at 12:11, opening the West Wing stairwell door. Whoever used it the second time moved toward the mezzanine exactly where Dennis had gone to investigate. By late summer of 2014, the company shut down the depot and cleared out the interior. Cleanup crews unearthed a small personal cassette recorder near a ventilation shaft behind the third bay. It contained about 30 seconds of audio, the hum of lights, a pair of quick footsteps, a metallic clank, then Dennis's voice saying, "Who's up there?" followed by a short distortion burst and silence. Audio engineers confirmed the tape had been magnetically warped, likely by exposure to a strong field, not heat or age. There was another strange detail buried in the sheriff's supplementary report. a mention of radio interference in patrol channels between 12 and 12:30. The on-call dispatcher logged fragments of words bleeding through static asterisk. Northgate, lights out, he's still here. Asterisk, none of the other guards were on duty that night, and the next scheduled patrol wasn't until morning. Years later, a local journalist named Owen Ralston revisited the case for a regional history program. He interviewed former employees and found that in 1998, 2 decades earlier, another guard, 39-year-old Gerald Pike, had disappeared during overnight maintenance. Same mezzanine, same missing camera footage, same unexplained power surge. Back then, the report blamed faulty wiring. Ralston tracked down Gerald's surviving son, who showed him an old Polaroid his father had taken before the disappearance. The photo captured the West Wing catwalk at night, lights flickering in the distance. In the lower right corner, partially blurred, was a faint silhouette that seemed to be looking down at whoever held the camera. Analysts couldn't verify whether it was a reflection or a person. But when the journalist compared the layout of that image with modern floor plans, he noticed something: the angle matched exactly where Dennis's flashlight was later found. What made it worse, the timestamp written in blue ink on the Polaroid's border, asterisk, the 3rd of April 1998, 12:11 a. M asterisk was identical to the digital record of Dennis's badge swipe, asterisk 12:11 a. M asterisk, 2 men, 16 years apart, logged in the same minute of the hour, in the same corridor, just before both vanished. Electrical engineers consulted during Ralston's project suggested a pattern of ground faults that might have caused rolling blackouts localized to one wing, possibly scrambling old analog video circuits. It could explain the synchronized failures, but they couldn't explain how both guards' ID logs and physical traces pointed to motion beyond any camera's field. In late autumn of 2021, the depot site was finally demolished. Before the demolition, a volunteer archivist named Leah Torres cataloged remaining items from the security office for the county museum. Inside a rusted filing cabinet, she found the original duty notebook sealed in a plastic evidence bag. Most pages were smudged, but the last line stood clear under the dried ink. Asterisk. Still hearing it. Will inspect. Asterisk. Beneath it, barely visible under a tilt of light, another faint line appeared, impressed by pen pressure, not ink. Forensic enhancement later revealed, asterisk, recording this time. Asterisk. That phrase matched an unfiled cassette found near Dennis's locker years earlier, the same type used for the warped tape. The archivist played it carefully on a restored deck. The audio was faint, but at the 13-second mark came what experts described as a pattern of steps, counted 7, then stop. The acoustics placed it roughly 10 feet above the ground, consistent with the mezzanine. When news of the find resurfaced, Ralston added an epilogue to his documentary. He pointed out that both the 1998 and 2014 incidents shared one quiet constant. The security logs always mentioned footsteps, but never the echo that should have followed in a steel-floored building. He speculated that the mezzanine's partial collapse during construction years earlier created a space that resonated oddly, bending sound in ways the old analog recorders couldn't track. Maybe, he said in the closing narration, what Dennis heard wasn't someone walking, but the building replaying itself. The official record lists Dennis Halbrook as missing, presumed deceased. No remains were ever found. The West Wing mezzanine was melted down with the rest of the metal. Today, the old depot grounds are a parking lot for long-haul trucks. Drivers who park overnight sometimes mention hearing boots pacing above the asphalt when the wind picks up, though there's nothing there, just open sky. Local radio traffic still gets random interference near mile marker 32, short bursts that resemble a steady rhythm of footsteps. At this point, the facts that remained were simple. 2 guards, years apart, logged the same minute, heard the same sound, and left no image behind. The rest, whatever it was, stayed between the missing frames of a camera that never recorded and a notebook line that never should have been there. The stories. Why the paramedic returned to that turnout. In early March of 2017, a state trooper found a decommissioned ambulance parked just off a mountain turnout east of Ridge County. The vehicle was empty, its back doors wide open, with one boot and a stethoscope left on the asphalt. It was later confirmed the items belonged to a paramedic named Mark Renner, who had driven that same route almost exactly 1 year earlier. What drew him back to the same turnout became the center of one of the strangest internal reviews in the county's emergency services history. Mark was 39, a quiet man who'd spent nearly 2 decades in the field. He'd seen wrecks, fires, and overdoses, the kind of scenes that hollowed out most people within a few years, but he stayed steady. Colleagues said he was professional, unshakable. The only story that ever seemed to trouble him was an accident from late February of 2016, a head-on collision on Route 92 involving a young couple and their infant daughter. The child had survived for 23 minutes in his care before the helicopter arrived, but the parents hadn't made it. Mark never forgot her crying. That sound stayed with him long after the shift ended. According to dispatch logs, Mark stopped requesting overnight shifts after that incident. He rotated into training duties for a few months, then back to field work once he was cleared by department counseling. Nothing seemed off until that following March, when he quietly signed up for the same overnight route, the same mountain stretch, and never came home. Investigators later reconstructed his movements from station cameras and gas receipts. He'd clocked in at 7:04 p.m., stopped for coffee at a roadside diner around 8:30, and drove north up the highway before pulling into the turnout just after 9:10. The dash cam on his unit, recovered from the ambulance, recorded 19 minutes of footage before cutting out. It showed a still landscape, empty road, light snow, and Mark stepping out of the cab, walking toward the guardrail, then disappearing into the dark. There was no struggle, no second figure, no sound beyond the wind. The first assumption was suicide. But the ground search found no trace. No footprints beyond a few feet from the guardrail, no sign of a fall down the ravine. The terrain was steep but not lethal, and cadaver dogs found nothing. When heavy rains swept through 2 days later, investigators halted the search. The county logged it as a presumed drowning, though the river below was shallow and slow-moving that time of year. Nearly 6 months passed before anything new surfaced. In August, a hiker found a sealed envelope wedged beneath a loose plank at a forest overlook, about 3 miles from the turnout. Inside was a folded piece of paper in a waterproof bag, written in uneven block letters. "I came back because I heard her." The note was signed M.R. and dated the same night Mark vanished. At first, analysts dismissed it as a hoax, maybe something left by someone who'd followed the case in the news. But when the lab examined the paper, they confirmed partial fingerprints matching Mark's employment file. The note's ink also matched a brand of pen issued in ambulance restock kits that year. For a while, speculation spread quietly through the department. Some said Mark had been unstable, still haunted by the loss of the infant. Others insisted he'd been fine. Then, an old colleague, a retired dispatcher named Ruth Canning, came forward with something she'd kept an archived radio call from the night of his disappearance. She hadn't turned it in earlier because she thought it was just static bleed from another channel, but she'd kept the recording out of habit. When the file was cleaned and enhanced, it revealed something strange. A faint secondary voice overlaying Mark's transmission. He'd called in a routine report. "Unit 307, clear, returning to station." But beneath his words was another voice, faint and distorted, repeating a single phrase, "Still here." Audio experts couldn't fully isolate the sound. It could have been cross-channel interference, a bleed from another frequency, or an artifact from faulty wiring. Still, that clip reignited interest in the case. When investigators compared the timestamps, they realized the radio call had been made exactly 1 minute before the dashcam cut out. Following the renewed attention, a new team reviewed Mark's digital trail. On his department-issued tablet, recovered from the front seat, the last accessed file wasn't a dispatch log. It was a photo stored in a personal folder labeled Training Refs. The image, according to metadata, had been taken 1 year earlier on the night of the crash. It showed the infant's car seat illuminated by the ambulance's interior light with a small knitted blanket tucked inside. Nothing seemed unusual, until they enhanced the reflection on the rear window. A faint outline of Mark turned toward the seat, mouth open as if speaking. The lead investigator, Lieutenant Harris, later told a local paper that what struck him most wasn't the evidence, but the timing. Every major event in Mark's final weeks corresponded with the accident's anniversary, the same dates, the same hours, even the same shift requests. It was as if he'd been tracing the exact pattern of that night. The county eventually filed its final report as undetermined circumstances. The official narrative suggested exhaustion, stress, and possible exposure contributing to disorientation and accidental injury. Yet, off the record, several responders admitted unease. One firefighter recalled hearing a distant sound of crying during the initial search, echoing faintly through the ravine, though no infant was ever found. In 2018, the turnout was repaved and renamed, and most people moved on. But every year, around late February, local radio operators report short bursts of static on the old EMS frequency. They last only seconds and usually coincide with wind gusts off the ridge. Nothing verifiable ever transmits through. Today, a small marker stands at that turnout, a simple white post with no inscription. Truckers still pull over there to check their brakes before the steep descent. Some say if you stop long enough, the silence feels heavier than it should, as if the air itself remembers something unresolved. No one ever proved what happened to Mark Renner. Theories range from a fall to voluntary disappearance, even to mistaken identity. What remains certain is that he returned there by choice. The note, the radio call, the anniversary, all pointed toward a man circling back to a moment he couldn't let go of. At this point, the facts that remained were simple. A paramedic haunted by one unfinished call, a turnout carved into the mountainside, and an unanswered question that time refused to bury. The rest is silence, the kind that fills the air between sirens, waiting for someone to break it again. The stories. Ranger station logs noted a missing hiker at noon. The radio crackled just after lunch, and the clipboard showed a blank line beside a borrowed bear spray canister. The word missing sat in block letters on the duty sheet, and the clock over the map board ticked louder than usual. Renata Vale worked the desk that week, 38, seasonal ranger with a stubborn streak for clean paperwork. The station sat outside a popular canyon where the trail ran through scrub pine, and July heat made the air taste metallic. Her plan for the day was simple: clear the lost and found shelf and call 2 vendors about water filters. Plans changed when a volunteer handed her the trail phone and said a worried brother was holding. He said his sister failed to text from the halfway point, and he used the word routine like a spell. He gave a name that did not exactly match the sign-in sheet, and his voice thinned when Renata asked about clothing and pack color. He had a screenshot of their last conversation, time-stamped just before noon, and said a ranger blog recommended checking the canyon switchbacks first. Renata felt the quiet alarm that starts in a seasoned ranger's hands, the kind that steadies rather than shakes. She called the number on the permit sticker that matched the closest name, and a voicemail box chirped with a clipped greeting. She checked the station cameras that watched the parking turnouts and found a silver sedan rolling in at 10:20. The driver wore a brimmed hat and taped the ends of the laces, a detail Renata wrote down because details age poorly when pressure arrives. The volunteer named Marco searched the trailhead kiosk for the morning log, while Renata stepped into the sun and scanned the ridge. Wind pushed dry heat across the gravel, and a jay scolded from the utility pole. She keyed dispatch and said they had a potential overdue hiker, not confirmed, and that initial checks were underway. She kept the language tight because words build momentum, and momentum brings helicopters that the budget cannot always afford. A woman in gym shorts approached with a dog and said she had heard a shout near the lower falls, short and sharp like a name. The dog sniffed the air and leaned toward the creek, then lost interest and sat her down. Renata asked about time and direction, then thanked her and pressed the note card against the map with a magnet. Witness statements fail without anchors, so she pinned the details to the grid and reviewed them aloud. Marco returned with the binder of trail camera stills that interns pulled from a motion unit near the bridge. The images showed the brimmed hat at 11:16, then again at noon on the switchback above the falls. The shirt color looked different under the dappled light, a common effect on digital stills that gave Renata a moment of doubt. She printed 2 frames and circled the pack strap, then clipped them to a clipboard for the field check. Her simple plan melted fully when dispatch called back with archived calls. A person had phoned the tip line at 11:42 and asked about trail closures on the East Rim, then hung up when asked for a callback number. The caller used a masked service that had failed before, and the audio had that empty room sound that suggested a roadside kiosk or a cheap motel. Renata pressed a knuckle against the map and agreed to log the call as related. She put together a step-by-step, starting light and staying local to the canyon. First, a hasty sweep from the bridge to the switchbacks with 1 ranger and 1 volunteer. Second, a parking lot inventory to match plates to permits and to note any vehicles with cooling engines that did not match sign-ins. Third, a witness walk with the dog owner to the lower falls, with a promise to return her to the trailhead within the hour. She radioed the plan and heard the click of acknowledgement from Wyatt Perales, 32, trail tech and steady boots in rough ground. They moved out along the creek, and the summer smell shifted from dust to algae and sunscreen. A couple in sun hats pointed to a narrow ledge where someone had left a crushed water bottle and a candy wrapper. Renata photographed the area with a department phone, then bagged the trash because trash turns into stories when the wrong eyes find it. She kept her sentences short on the radio and noted her times with a pen that left grooves deeper than the ink. At the switchback, Wyatt found boot scuffs that angled off the tread and into scrub so tight it would punish any shortcut. He pointed to a pressed patch of grass, then to a low branch with a pale scrape that matched soft plastic. Renata crouched and saw a faint thread from athletic tape, the same color she remembered from the still. The thread clung to rough bark, a small but useful tether between the images and the ground. They moved higher and reached a shallow spur where the view opened into a dry basin. On the spur, a pair of hikers said they passed a woman alone who looked back often, as if waiting for someone who never arrived. The hikers spoke slowly and paused to remember, then agreed to write brief statements at the station later that afternoon. They offered a photo from a distance that showed only a shape in heat shimmer, and the horizon looked bleached and wide. Renata asked the brother for more context by text, keeping questions narrow and practical. What snacks did she favor? Any injuries last year? And did she ever speak about this specific canyon? He replied that his sister planned the hike to test a new route from a guide forum and sent a blurry screenshot of a message board thread. A username bragged about a hidden shelf that saved 20 minutes, and that sentence pressed a new line into Renata's plan. She called the district's archive and asked for old incident notes related to the shelf, and the clerk said there were 2 minor rescues on a heat weekend 3 summers ago. Those notes described short slips and stubborn walkers and contained a detail that felt right and wrong at the same time. Both incidents started at noon when shadows shortened and depth perception failed, and both involved hikers who disliked crowds and sought quiet. Another message arrived from the brother that changed tone from worried to careful. He said a coworker reportedly spotted a silver sedan at a grocery near the highway at 1:30 with the brimmed hat visible through the windshield. He said the coworker did not want to get involved, and that felt useful in a different way. Renata thanked him and wrote the time down, then circled highway with a question mark that drew a slow breath from Wyatt. They pushed through Manzanita to reach the rumored shelf and found it narrower than described, with a crumbling margin that looked unfriendly. A faint shoe print showed a split tread that matched a popular brand, and a smear on the rock smelled like cheap bug spray. Wyatt anchored a line to a juniper and leaned just far enough to see a small alcove with shade and a clean view of the bridge. A person could wait there unseen, then return to the trail when passing groups moved on. Renata called dispatch to log the shelf and asked for a quiet check on the grocery footage if the store manager would allow it without a formal request. She kept the ask light, and the clerk at the store reportedly agreed to review only the parking lot from 1:15 to 1:45. While they waited, they spoke to a fisherman who said he had heard someone practicing a greeting near the bridge, polite and warm, the way people rehearse before calling an office. They returned to the station to regroup and found the dog owner had kept her promise about the statements. She drew a crude map of her walk and marked the spot where the shout came, which lined up with the shelf by a neat stroke. Renata checked the plate list from the lot, and one entry bothered her because the registration sticker covered an older color. That usually meant a cheap repaint, often done quickly when a car changes hands among friends. The call from the store came back while the clock swept toward 4. Footage reportedly showed a silver sedan near the outer edge, and the driver wore a brimmed hat. The camera caught the driver opening the trunk, then closing it without removing anything. The driver sat for a full minute, then left the lot with a slow signal that suggested careful timing rather than confusion. That action made less sense if a hiker was lost, and more sense if a narrative needed space. Renata asked the brother to send any recent photos of his sister's gear so they could match brands and colors to the thread on the branch. He sent a camping picture from spring, and the pack straps matched the stills with unnerving accuracy. He also sent a photo of a laminated media badge from a fitness channel and apologized for forgetting to mention that side gig. Renata stared at the badge and felt the click of pieces rubbing into place. She pulled the permit files again and found a second entry from the morning that used a near match to the name, with a transposed letter that looked accidental at first glance. The second entry had a note in different handwriting that said, "Early shoot near bridge, approved by office." The office had approved no such shoot as far as Renata knew, and a deep memory of an email warning about unauthorized product videos rose to the surface. Those videos sometimes used stage trouble to capture attention, then rode the wave for clicks and ad buys. She contacted the regional office and asked whether a crew had requested permission that day, and the answer came back tidy and negative. The office asked for details, and Renata kept her language cool and focused on logs and times. She included the masked call and the quiet shelf, and the fact that a brimmed hat appeared where a plan would benefit from a dramatic turn. She asked for guidance on whether to treat the case as a welfare check or as a permit violation with a side of false alarm. Before the office replied, Wyatt flagged a new detail from the camera stills that had felt unimportant earlier. The brimmed hat in the second still carried a small pin that caught the sun, and the same pin appeared on the media badge in the spring photo. It was a tiny compass rose with 3 points bent, a logo for a training program that marketed grit and quiet strength. The pin created a line between online identity and trail identity, often a line people try to blur when views are currency. The volunteer team returned from the upper spur with a clean report and no sign of distress along the ridge. A group of teenagers said they watched a drone rise above the bridge and glide toward the shelf, then return quickly when someone shouted about rules. The teenagers filmed the drone on a phone, and the video captured the brimmed hat figure leaning on the railing, then turning away when the shout landed. Renata saved the clip and documented the time, then asked the group to leave contact details in case the office needed follow-up. As evening lights softened, dispatch called with a quiet advisory. A patrol unit had found a silver sedan parked at a scenic turnout 15 miles east, empty and cooling, with a folded jacket in the back. The officer waited nearby without lights and reported a second vehicle pulling in close, then leaving when the cruiser rolled forward. The plate on the second car belonged to a rental agency with a flexible policy about credit cards, a detail Renata captured without judgment. The office finally replied and advised a welfare check with a parallel inquiry into misuse of emergency channels. They recommended a measured approach that prioritized safety and avoided public drama. Renata agreed, and then called the brother again and asked him to come to the station, explaining that in-person rooms make details easier to manage. He arrived with shoulders high and hands careful, and he looked like someone who disliked being on the wrong side of a counter. He admitted the channel sometimes staged challenges, and that his sister had pitched a solo speed test that needed daylight and a sense of risk. He insisted that no real danger was planned, only a late check-in, followed by a triumphant return and a lesson about preparation. He said a friend reportedly stood by with water near the highway, and the masked call was about closures because crowds ruined dramatic timing. He said he panicked when she missed the planned text by a full hour and called the station because the bit felt wrong. Renata listened and typed, then asked to speak with the sister by phone. The brother made a call on speaker, and the brimmed hat answered with a small breath, then a quick apology that sounded practiced. She said she was safe and nearby, and that she feared trouble once she realized how many people had watched the bridge. She agreed to meet at the station within 30 minutes and added that the shelf was a mistake because the rock felt greasy and mean. She arrived with salt on her face and a steady gaze, 34, freelance trainer and editor for a mid-sized channel. She wore the pin on the brim and kept her hands open on the counter, then gave a full account that matched much of the timeline. She described the shelf and the alcove and admitted the staged silence to build tension for a cut. She said the drone operator backed out when a shout scared him and that the grocery stop was a pause to decide whether to end the bit early. Renata walked her through the consequences with a calm voice and clear steps. They would log the misuse of the term missing in the station ledger and forward a report on the masked call to the office. They would recommend a fine for the drone flight near the bridge and review the permit files for the transposed name entry. They would also offer a voluntary donation to the volunteer team for the hours spent and recommend a public safety note if the channel posted any edited footage. The woman nodded and said she understood, then asked whether the station planned to call the county. Renata said the county dispatch already sat in the loop and had agreed to remain cooperative as long as the channel avoided inflaming viewers. She added that the station took missing reports seriously because moments consume resources, and that even staged quiet pressures real systems. The woman agreed to record a clear statement and accepted a brochure on safe filming that looked oddly gentle in the harsh light. Wyatt stepped outside and watched the last cars roll out of the lot, and the air finally cooled enough to feel kind. The dog from earlier barked once from a passing truck, and the fisherman from the creek lifted 2 fingers without slowing. Renata filed the forms and wrote a final note that tied the shelf to the old rescues and the pin to the badge and the masked call to timing. The station lights hummed and the clock hands slid past 6, then found their mark without ceremony. By the time the brother and sister left, the word missing on the duty sheet had a line through it. Renata kept the original note card with the magnet hole because records tell stories when memory wants to embellish. The office would likely call tomorrow and ask for clarifications, and the drone policy would probably gain a new sentence. She felt the usual mix of relief and irritation that follows a false alarm, and the strange sympathy for people who turn risk into currency. Later, the channel posted a short video that downplayed the panic, and the comments argued about rules and grit. The station received 2 thank you emails from hikers who heard the news secondhand and a complaint from a person who disliked the fines on principle. Renata archived the messages and watered the plant on the windowsill, then wrote one more line in the log about the shelf that was not a shortcut. The sentence ended with a plain warning that noon creates flat shadows and false confidence, a small truth inside a larger one. In quiet moments after a shift like that, she believed most people want a story that forgives them. Trails do not forgive, they teach. And the classroom never closes just because cameras blink. The station would open again at 7, and the clipboard would carry new names, and the clock would tick in the same steady way. Somewhere on the ridge, a jay would scold the wind, and the shelf would wait with its narrow promise, ready to turn bravado into paperwork. The stories. The librarian who reopened maps after one voicemail. The voicemail hit the library phone system at 9:16 in the morning, and staff noted the time on the call sheet. The town's map room had been shuttered since 2016 for budget reasons, with the keys sealed in a gray envelope. Rhea Calder was 38 and worked as a reference librarian, and she was supposed to weed duplicate travel guides. She liked lists and quiet projects that finished by closing time, and she intended to be home before the streetlights switched on. She opened the staff mailbox for routine messages, and the new voicemail had a subject line that looked wrong. The timestamp matched today, yet the voice sounded grainy and old, like cassette tape found in a hot attic. The caller sounded rushed but clear, and he used a steady dispatcher tone that carried through the static. He said the emergency detour map in the bridge packet had its north arrow wrong, and the depot road turn would strand drivers. He named 2 intersections locals would recognize, and he said the paper copy got flipped during a late-night duplication. He asked whoever heard this to check the flat files in the public map room, and then he hung up fast. Rhea paused because the library was planning a small display for the bridge reopening next week. The town crew wanted visitors to see old blueprints and printed maps, and the staff had quietly promised to unseal the room. She replayed the message and wrote down every location, and she typed the intersections into the library catalog notes. The bridge packet sat behind the desk in a manila folder, and she slipped the detour sheet out with a quiet tug. The detour looked normal at first glance, and the label fonts matched the county style guide. The north arrow pointed toward the top of the page, and a thick red line wrapped through 3 turns like a ribbon. She looked for a small staff stamp, and there it was near the border in faint purple. It said copied from firehouse drawer after warehouse incident, which the old reference notebook linked to 2009. Her job and training lived in the overlaps between paper and people, and she felt the old itch to confirm. The warehouse incident had clogged the streets for days, and archived calls reportedly mentioned bad directions at least twice. She brought the folder to the workroom and pulled the microfilm drawer, and the metal slides rasped against old paint. Dispatch logs on film listed closed streets and detours, and operators marked trouble points with pencil circles. 2 logs from the same night mentioned Depot Road, and the note said trucks turned the wrong way toward the river. One line said, "See temporary detour plate beside flat file B," which sounded like a direct breadcrumb. Flat file B waited in the locked room behind the genealogy shelves, and the envelope with the keys lived in a safe. She signed a paper acknowledging responsibility for access, and she carried the keys with both hands like a relic. The map room smelled like dust and linen, and the ceiling fan ticked from a loose blade. She slid open a drawer and found rolled sheets, and brittle plastic sleeves stuck to their neighbors like leaves after rain. The temporary detour plate was a stiff board with a taped photocopy, and someone had written "mirror warning" in grease pencil. The north arrow had a big X over it, and a second arrow pointed to the right side with the word "up." She spread the board on a table and placed washers on the corners, and the paper fought to curl back into memory. The Depot Road turn looked reversed compared to the packet, and the red line as drawn would lead drivers into gravel. Her phone compass showed north toward the windows, and the temporary plate matched her reading within a few degrees. The packet map disagreed by a wide margin, and her stomach tightened like it always did when details misbehaved. She printed a recent aerial photo from the county website, and she centered on Depot Road and the bridge approach. A water tower shadow ran northeast by the clock, and that matched the plate, but not the packet. She called Tomas Brink, who was 54 and ran maintenance, and she asked about the packet source. He said a volunteer scanned old map holders in the spring, and staff patched labels onto the county base. He remembered a late-night copy job at the firehouse during the warehouse week, and he thought someone flipped a master. He had no hard proof, but he told her to talk with a retired cartographer who lived near the marsh. The cartographer was named Lyda Morell, and she was 71 with careful eyes and a faded canvas jacket. Lyda said she had drawn the original emergency plates on Mylar, and she always sketched north as a small star. Lyda remembered the night the plates went missing, and she spoke like a teacher marking a board after a test. The firehouse copier worked only on the legal tray that night, and someone fed the plate upside down, then pressed copy twice. Lyda said her handwriting on the board looked like her early notes, and she pointed to the grease pencil word "up." She kept a photo from that week that showed 2 volunteers holding the board outside, and the sun angle matched. Rhea asked if the board ever returned to the library, and Lyda shrugged like she had told this story several times. She said yes, the board came back 2 days later, and someone tucked it into drawer B and shut the room. Rhea documented everything as if the board could grow legs and escape, and she wrote dates beside each step. She took photos of the board and the packet, and she copied the microfilm lines, and she initialed each printed page. The voicemail still bothered her because the timestamp said "today," yet the content smelled like an old headache. She checked the library phone system logs, and a vendor note explained a recent server migration for stored voicemail. An alert said a batch of delayed messages had been flushed to mailboxes, and the explanation used dry language and disclaimers. She asked the vendor to search for the caller number, and they returned an old service name with a billing code. The code matched a dispatch line used during the warehouse week, which explained the voice and the choice of words. Someone had recorded this warning years ago, and the system had kept it like a seed in a jar. Rhea asked if the caller name could be released, and the vendor sent a redacted sheet with initials and a job title. A local news archive matched the initials to a night guard who reportedly died of natural causes in his parked car. The guard had phoned the correction before the medical event, and he had tried to reach any desk that could fix the map. His message never reached a human while the roads were jammed, and the bad copy camped in a drawer. Rhea brought her notes to Tomas, and he carried the folder to a brief meeting with the town clerk. The clerk asked for confirmations and a plan, and Ria offered a clear sequence that would be easy to retrace next year. Step 1 was to treat the packet map as untrustworthy and to replace it with a fresh export from the county base. Step 2 was to reconcile the arrow with on-site compass readings and to annotate with the date and the staff initials. Step 3 was to scan the temporary board and let the grease pencil speak and to place its image in the appendix. Step 4 was to add a small note in the bridge display and to credit anonymous archival materials for clarifying the route. Tomas drove to Depot Road with her after lunch, and they parked near a mailbox whose nameplate had peeled away. The river ran dull and brown beside the road, and a detour sign leaned like a tired person after a long shift. Ria stood where the red line on the packet would have sent traffic, and she looked through cottonwoods at rough gravel. The correct route followed a narrow paved lane to the east, and the wrong turn aimed drivers toward a soft shoulder. A school bus rolled past on the narrow lane, and the driver waved like this was already muscle memory. The aerial photo printed in the morning matched the bus path, and the packet map did not. They stopped by a small clinic 2 turns away, and the nurse behind the counter remembered the warehouse week. The clinic took calls from stranded drivers, and a nurse reportedly walked out to redirect a line of cars at sundown. The town clerk approved the correction that afternoon, and the county uploaded a clean detour with verified arrows. Tomas signed off on new signs, and the bridge crew shrugged like this was just another Tuesday with wet concrete. Ria asked for permission to open the map room weekly, and the clerk looked toward the budget with a careful tilt. The request had no funding yet, but the clerk liked the argument that open rooms produce fewer expensive mistakes. They agreed on a one-afternoon schedule under staff supervision, and Ria posted a notice near the staircase. She placed the temporary board in a display case with a modest label, and she kept the packet map below it with a sticky note. The sticky note said obsolete and see corrected version, and she included the date and her initials for future sanity. A footnote in the display explained that a delayed voicemail triggered the review and no personal names appeared. At the reopening of the bridge, the mayor shook hands and cut a ribbon, and the appetizers ran out fast. Drivers moved through the new approach like water down a smooth bed, and the detour signs wandered into storage. Tomas clapped her shoulder near the coffee urn, and he said quiet fixes rarely get banners, which is the point. Lyda visited the display the next morning, and she pressed her fingers against the glass like she was reading Braille. Rhea listened to the old voicemail one more time, and the voice had that tired confidence that comes from night work. He had said, please check the flat files, and it felt like he was speaking across a hallway rather than across years. On her desk, she kept a small notebook with 3 lines that she repeated when projects became slippery. Write down names of things as they are used, compare them to how they look on paper, test the direction with the Sunday. She added a 4th line in light ink to mark the lesson that felt both new and as old as maps. If a voice says the arrow is wrong, open the drawer before the parade trucks roll and the cameras arrive. In the months that followed, the room gathered quiet visitors, and the fan still ticked, but less often after tightening. Folks brought rolled plats from garages, and Ria labeled them carefully, then scanned and returned them with fresh sleeves. A contractor volunteered 2 hours a week to help with filing, and he taught her to spot scale bars that lied. Teachers brought students to trace creeks with cotton thread, and one kid noticed a benchmark star on the courthouse steps. The bridge display came down after the season changed, and the temporary board went back into drawer B with a proper sleeve. A small typed note inside the sleeve told the story in 12 lines, with dates and initials and measured claims. It said a voicemail arrived and matched earlier dispatch references, and staff verified the arrow with compass and aerial evidence. It said a clean map replaced the packet version before the reopening, and the town's roads agreed. Ria did not call it a miracle, and she did not call it fate, because both words would cheapen 12 careful steps. She called it library work, which sounded plain, yet it held more weight now that a ribbon had been cut. On quiet afternoons, she stood at the window where the compass had pointed, and she felt the same small pull. North was where the light made honest shapes on paper, and where a tired voice could still find the right room. When she locked the door each week, she thought about the man who made the call, and she wished he had been heard. His warning crossed an odd gap in the system, and it landed like a folded note slid under a door. In a town where stories often arrive secondhand, The plain ones sometimes carry the longest mileage. One message, one board, one arrow corrected, and a room reopened so a drawer could be opened without ceremony.